What would you guys say the skill set is that's needed for an effective coach?
Well, I can go with that. Yeah. Not only do they need the content and pedagogy, they also need to understand how to work with adults as opposed to students and younger children. And they need a skill set of how to work with teachers who are resistant to change and how to establish relationships with administrators, with co-workers, with the community. Should I say more?
That's great.
No, I think, it kind of, Kay's comment kind of piggybacks on what Beth said in terms of, where I work, we have a graduate program who prepares such people. And yes, they have to do content courses, they have to do courses in pedagogy and so forth, and as well as leadership, but that sort of interesting dynamic of how they're going to do once they're in the job is really good. Some of the best math people, frankly, don't relate too well to others, or as well as maybe we'd like them to. So it's just the whole issue.
I think it's the balance, too, and having competing demands.
Right.
And also understanding that you were part of something as a teacher.
Yeah.
You were part of the teacher group, and now you're not really part of the administrator group. Who do you belong to? Who's your tribe? Who do you associate with? Those kinds of things.
It'd be a very lonely job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's really, that's a great point. One of the sort of, no, it's not funny, but it's ironic, I guess. I remember having a conversation with one of the people that we work with, and we were talking about, when she got this new job, and as Beth just said, it sort of changes your tribe, and she was in a carpool with some people, and all of a sudden, when she got that job, people didn't talk as much, and she wasn't engaged as much, and so they, her premise was, I guess they're threatened by this new job I have, or whatever. Because, long story short, I ended up driving to work myself because it wasn't working for any of us.
Well, and they don't know if they're an arm of the administration.
Right. Yeah. There's that dynamic as well.
And do you think that's should they be an arm of the administration? Yes, no, always, never?
Well, that goes back to the navigating relationships thing. In other words, the most successful specialists that we work with have an ongoing, strong relationship with building administrators, however you define them. And they find ways to do that. Because first of all, those positions change. People, I got this great relationship with my principal, now she's gone. So, and there is a bit of power and control that such people have. So, if you're at loggerheads with your principal, if you can't communicate with your principal, if you can't get that principal to support what you're doing every day, then you're not going to be real successful.
I think it's about keeping the confidences of both sides, because you're traversing the middle of the
and it's about balance.
Yeah. But and that's something I think is very hard. As a teacher, you have your community, and you get to say a lot of things, be really free with how you express your opinion, and all of a sudden you understand as a coach that you can't be as free about that. And I think sometimes that's one of the toughest lessons learned for them.
So, but you're back to your point. Your point is really good in the sense that nobody necessarily defines it this way, but there are quasi-administrative responsibilities of the specialists that, one of the things we do in my own graduate program, we require them to all take a supervision course. Not that they necessarily going to formally do the observation, but they're regularly going to co-plan, they're regularly going to co-teach with teachers, and so they need to understand what is it about supervision that indirectly they're doing. For a number of years, we've collected data, self-reported data from specialists and people that we work with, and we find that fairly decent-sized percentage of what they do is in the name of professional development and support to teachers. But more and more, something called administrative duties crops up. And then this past year, for the first time, we asked the question, to what extent are you working with brand new, meaning new to the building, or first-year teachers? And that became a pretty sizable percentage of time for two of the school districts. So it's the stuff that happens, and it goes back to navigating relationships. In other words, it doesn't matter that you've been in that building for X years. If you have an administrative change or the administration above that person has said, you know what, we're going to especially work with first-year teachers this year, and guess whose duty that's going to be? Yours. So often they're not necessarily part of that conversation, but they're very much a part of the implementation.
talk to me a little bit more about your view, your vision for, I guess, the coach-teacher dynamic in that situation when you're sitting down one-on-one or a group and things like that. How do you think that could or should look?
It should look comfortable. There has to be an environment that allows the teacher to be honest and open, and for the coach to respond in the same way. If there's a judgment call in any way, it's not going to be an effective session.
I mean, the notion about understanding the roles and having confidence, I guess, in yourself, and then being comfortable in day to day.
And there's a trust factor.
Yeah.
Huge trust.
Huge trust factor.
And I think just a complete respect for the person that you're working with, that, usually people are doing the best they can. They're not purposely doing things to be, a bad teacher. And so when you're in a coaching situation, if you can come at it from this person is really coming to this with really everything they've got, but it's not working, then how can I help them? How can I bring them forward? And I think for the coaching situation, if the teacher feels that that person has, nothing but the best in mind for them, then it's going to work. But if they feel judged for one moment, it won't work. And I think it's a really special relationship, and it's very hard to cultivate and hard to get there. And we see a lot of our coaches struggle with starting at a very tentative spot in that relationship and then building. Especially when they're new. I mean, we've watched some really fascinating things happen with our new coaches and how they've made inroads and really understanding the amount of time it takes to get to what an experienced coach can do. It's really interesting.
So we've had this project for 6 or 7 years, and so we have what we call a core group of people who have come together over time, and we've discussed lots of things over the years. And I always say it's a group that's sort of like, when people say, you're going to Vegas, everything stays there, so they just tell us everything. And in fact, so they'll tell us they'll tell us stuff that Beth sort of alluded to, and that is they'll say, some teachers are resistant. And so I remember actually one of the specialists, I won't name this person, but who said, I ended up going to that teacher and saying to her, look, I'll help you. I'll do a pull-out program. I'll take some kids out in the hall and I'll work with them on a regular basis to help, improve some skills and so forth and so on. And her doing that developed a relationship that teacher became comfortable with her, which then allowed her to go into the classroom, which then allowed her to do some co-planning, co-teachings, which would have never happened initially. And so these little things, I'm supervising some interns in our college's own program now where they have to do an internship to get it's like the capstone of the certification process. And, one of the revelations a couple of weeks ago when I was talking to one of my candidates was, it's a very difficult 5th grade where she is. And so she's been able to gather one person who's really interested in doing some things relative to Common Core implementation. Well, that person was able then herself, because she's connected to the other 5th grade teachers, to bring other people. And so the intern was like, wow, this is so good. I'm making some inroads here. And these people would have never had a conversation with me prior to this work and so forth and so on. So that, little things become big things in the work of establishing that relationship and the confidence and the comfort that, Kay responded to earlier.
Another thing that the project does is it allows the coaches to talk about the things they are doing. Finally, they have a peer.
Right.
Like I said, it can be a very lonely job. And this gives them a peer group to discuss the things, how you handled certain situations, and we did scenarios, and it really helped build the skill set of the coaches.
And that's a really important point. In other words, in some of the notes that we prepared for this, which we're clearly not following, which is fine. Which is fine.
This is fantastic.
But the notion about sustainability for such people. So here's a person who finds time to meet with her people once a week. And I know she probably has this great agenda of stuff she's doing with them, but just the opportunity for them to come together and share some successes and some frustrations and so forth is really, really important. Imagine a school district that's very rural, when people who are in this role don't have the opportunity to ever come together and meet, and you sort of wonder what are they doing to keep them motivated to sustain their work, to support their work on a regular basis. And I think it's huge for people in these positions.
I think also it's really important that people understand that they think that, okay, if we just do this PD will work.
Yeah.
Here's the way you do it, and it's surefire and all of that. And I think when they talk to each other, they understand it's really about that understanding who your faculty, who your staff is. And so that you can think about, well, my staff is interested in this, or my staff does this, or I have a staff that's really, they're all non-tenured teachers for the most part. So the way that you're going to address those needs are going to be very different.
Right.
And I think that's a really important part about it. And I think sometimes people come to it thinking, I'm going to, implement this in this particular way, and it's going to go great and all of that. And it's really just like teaching in a classroom. That's one similarity I think is huge. You have to understand your population. You have to know who you're working with. You have to connect with them. All those things in order to help them learn is the same with the teachers. So I think that's a big piece that comes together when they get to talk to each other. Well, I tried this, but how about if you do this? And sort of that molding it and twisting it and turning it and making it their own so that it's the most powerful for them.
What are some strategies you might recommend for coaches who are initially trying to build those relationships that you were referring to earlier? Are there any that you found to be effective and seem to be effective?
Well, I mean, I would say first, one of the things is that they really need to be in touch with people who have done and or continue to do this work, because these are veterans, and basically ask questions. It's not unlike, I mean, the analogy is beginning teacher. Here you are thrust in a building, and frankly, I don't care how good your student teaching experience was. You're now in charge every day. And similarly, look, I know you're good in math and you've had a great teaching career, but this is a different. You're not teaching second grade anymore. You're trying to deliver, the math initiative in a whole building. That's all aspects of it: professional development, working with teachers, and so forth. So to think for a minute that you're going to be, off the ground running and be, largely successful is naive at best. So who do you go to? I mean, as good as this supervisor is to my right here, I want to talk to people who are doing this or have done this and what seems to work for them. But then going back to something Beth just said, which is really critical, and that is every school has their own dynamic, every school has their own culture, and at minimum, the first thing you can do is learn that culture. And it's different because there are two different shifts. In other words, if all of a sudden you become the math specialist in that building, you've never been in that building before, take some time to learn the building, take some time to learn the culture. And I mean, one sort of glimpse of what our people do, we asked them one time, well, what do you do and what are the kind of duties that you have? And several of them said, well, I do bus duty or whatever. And I remember raising that point, and I said, well, bus duty, what's the point of that? And then, no, I want to continue to do bus duty because that gets me connected with my colleagues, and I can do a heck of a lot of work while we're waiting for the bus and so forth and so on. And they also realized I'm out there freezing just like them, and I'm a part of the team. So until there's acceptance there, there's that. And then the other sort of, it's related but different kind of acceptance in the role, and it's the something that Beth referred to earlier, and that is, again, it's great that you're a fourth grade teacher in that building for 15 years. You now have a totally different role, and people will be responding to you differently, looking at you differently, wondering why you got that job and they didn't, or any sort of situation. So sort of working around that, it's different but sort of related to that brand new person in a brand new school. But these guys, I'm sure, have other things to add to that.
I think the first thing they need to do is build credibility, and they do that by being in the classrooms. They do it by interacting with students, interacting with teachers, actually going in and teaching a lesson or taking a small group of students so the teacher can say, okay, she knows what she's doing, and then they start to build that trust. So once again, it goes back to those relationships.
So I learned that from Kay, because I was Kay's.
We go back,
and I was Kay's math resource teacher, and Kay was the resource teacher before that, which was basically before the idea of using the word coach was certainly out. But one of the things that we do recommend is getting in the classroom, because teachers, one of the biggest things that I think teachers say is, but my kids are different, or you haven't been in my room. And I respect that, because I have been in some classrooms where I would agree with that. I think that the dynamics of the classroom are certainly something that I need to experience in order to be able to help someone. So I think that is one of the best things you can do, is get in there and teach lessons, and then people go, you're willing to do it, you're willing to show it, and you're willing to be vulnerable and be observed by them and maybe be critiqued by them, and that vulnerability allows them to become vulnerable with you. And I think it's a key component, a key factor. We hear, because of the project, we hear from people all over the country who are alone in a school. Maybe they were just hired or just appointed, and they're floundering and scared, and they don't know what to do, and they've been shut down. And that's my usual recommendation, and my go-to is go offer to teach something. Go offer to take a group. Do anything that you can to get in there so that they can see that you, A, care about the kids, you care about them. But I think it's a lot about showing that I'm willing to do anything you're willing to do.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators has sort of recommended standards, which we were part of in terms of developing those, and 20 states now have certification efforts for specialists, and a lot of colleges and universities have programs. But the reality is, when such people are identified in a school district, they're appointed. Many of them have no certification. Many of them, well, you were a good math teacher. I think we want you to do this, or whatever process. Actually, we should talk about how does one become this specialist, and what do people like supervisors look for and so forth. But the reality is they're there, and so they do need, places to go to, places, people to look forward to working with, and the like, because many of them, even in areas where they've had such positions for a while, they may not have had the background in terms of really doing this work on a regular basis.
What do you think is, particularly challenging aspect of this for teachers, of being coached, if you will, if you're okay with that kind of language?
I think one of the biggest things is the idea that teachers are very afraid of being evaluated, and that we also look at teaching as a deficit mentality. Like, what are you doing wrong? What are all the things that you're doing wrong? And who wants to experience that? I mean, really, criticism and critiquing are two different things, and I think that teachers receive a lot of sort of feedback that may not feel is justified. So I think as a coach, understanding how to use feedback, what kinds of things to say, what strengths to look for, and how to build on strengths is really important. And I don't know that we're all in, the whole entire field has worked as well on that as we possibly could. It's really hard to get a big list of 25 things that I need to do for my next lesson. But maybe I just need to think about one or two things, work on those, and maybe use some of the strengths that I have. So I think for a coach to understand how to build on someone's strengths versus the deficits or the weaknesses is pretty important.
I just had a conversation with one of my coaches who she was meeting a lot of resistance from this one teacher. Pretty much the teacher said, "You're not welcome in my classroom." And so this coach had the perseverance. She said, so I'd kind of go and I'd stand at her door and say, "How we doing today?" And so the teacher was like, "Yeah, bye, out." And eventually the teacher had a question about how to teach something, and she actually went to the coach, and the coach said, "I'll come in and do it." And the teacher actually let her in her room. It went well, and now she's more than welcome. So it's that perseverance, never giving up. And another challenge, I think, is a teacher who perceives to be a very good teacher may not see the need to be coached by somebody. And that's when it's up to the coach to say, we're in this together. Let's do this together. And so, once again, building that trust.
But it also, in both Beth's response and Kay's, it goes back to something we talked about at the top here, and that's that leadership framework. And here's understanding the adult learner. And the adult learner, frankly, may resemble the 8-year-old learner in some ways, but is still an adult, and recognize that. And actually, when we sort of conceptualize the framework, Beth had a lot to do with us thinking about and reading about the adult learner. So you have that, and then also in Kay's example, this notion about Okay, I have to navigate this relationship. How am I going to get into her classroom? And if I have to go there every day and wave, I'm going to do that until for whatever reason this person feels comfortable to ask a question, and then there you go. So it's and I also like what Kay said about this. And I think you want this as a quality of anybody who's an educator, and that's persistence. It's not just today. You keep coming at them, and you find ways to come at the initiative differently, but you're still persistent in the solution of the problem.
And I think you have to understand, we talked a lot about this with coaches, and because it came up organically, is that you can't take everything personally. Not everything that is done and being said has to do with you in your role as a coach. It could be completely not related to you. And if you're going to do the job, you have to say, something's going on, I'm here to help, and sort of get past that. It's really important. Otherwise, the job will become overwhelming. It's a huge piece.
Tough skin.
Tough skin, very tough skin. And it really, a lot of it isn't personal. It feels personal, but it's really not.
What questions would you like to pose for coaches or those who are supporting coaches for them to consider regarding what we just talked about?
Well, one of the things I guess I'd wonder about, and this is sort of a heads up for Mrs. Sammons here. So when she or other people in her role are in a position to hire people as elementary math specialists, instructional leaders, coach, whatever name is being used, what do they look for? And then, once they hire that individual, how do you continue to keep those qualities up and foremost in their work every day?
I am looking for flexibility. I think that's a really important role. And you can maybe have a stronger background in the intermediate grades, but if you've got the ability to work with people, to understand how to navigate those relationships, you can learn the other things. But it's how you work with people, and motivation, being a self-starter is so important. You can't be waiting around for somebody to tell you what to do. You've got to look at the school culture and assess the situation and jump right in. So I think that flexibility and that being a self-starter is really, really important.
That the self-starter thing hasn't come up before in a direct way. That's a really important part because, as we've said a couple of different ways, these people are in the building. They're not just to some extent out there as the math specialist in the building. And if they're waiting for somebody to call them, that's not going to happen. So you need to, certainly figure out where you're going, and then have both the persistence and the awareness about where you are and where you need to go next and so forth. So the self-starting and continued assessment of your progress and therefore the progress of your building is really important.
So I also think what's really interesting about a math coach or math specialist or a math leader is that their role is very different all over the country. So if someone comes up to and says, I'm a math coach, then I have to ask 5 more questions to find out what kind of coach they are, what they're doing, or 10 more questions. And I think many of them maybe need a little bit more direction about what that means in that particular school. And so one of the recommendations that I would have is to sit down in your school with the administrator and say, what do you envision this looking like? And how are we going to communicate it to the teachers? Because many times we're in a building and the teacher's like, I don't know what's going on down there. I don't know what they're doing. And I think being extremely transparent about what the job is and what they're doing is really helpful to the coach, to the teachers, to the parent, to everyone, so that everybody is in on this role and can access it. So one of the, I think it's very confusing for many coaches who are sort of assigned the role, not in Kay's system, and certainly not in the systems that we're working with, because it's very clearly defined. In fact, we've asked for job descriptions before, but I'm talking about sort of, over the country. And when we get these little emails and someone's saying, I'm a new math coach, and I say, what does that mean for you? I'm not really sure. I'm supposed to help people with math, and I think that's fabulous, but I think it'll help everybody hit the ground running a little bit faster if it's defined a little bit more clearly. And of course, let it get organic too. Build it up as well.
And sort of related to that is the challenge that there isn't as much research out there about the impact of such people as there ought to be. So here, school districts around the country contemplating this bordering on half of the states in the country having certification, and Pat Campbell and her colleagues in the work within the state of Virginia, and some work in Ohio, and I'm going to come to a minute a recent doctoral study at the University of Louisville. But we need more about, A, what do they do and what's the impact? Regarding the Louisville study, she had a large data pool of kids who have taken NAEP where there was a math specialist assigned to the building, either full-time or part-time, and it was significantly achievement was significantly improved when the math specialist was full-time versus part-time, which is kind of interesting. And then, the two roles of the math specialist that popped in a significant way was the specialist in terms of his or her ability in doing professional development and also working with kids, which was interesting because those two dynamics are sort of in conflict with each other. In lots of models, if your job is to do professional development in the building, you don't have time to do pull-out programs with kids. And so what we want to tease out is in the programs where they were working with kids, it wasn't because the kids really needed support and therefore they were spending less time on professional development and what have you, but notions about how the job is conceptualized, how it's delivered, and then the impact is important for discussing this much more deeply.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I have to just bring up, because we collected some data from our coaches about how much time you spend during the day or week during things. Yeah. And so what we discovered was that you say professional development and someone might envision that that's an after-school workshop kind of thing. But what we found out was that many of our coaches considered doing a lesson in a classroom professional development because they planned it, they sat down, they thought about it, maybe they co-taught it, and then they talked about it afterwards, and it translated into a PLC where we planned. So certainly ideas about what professional learning looked like seem to be really important to our coaches as well. So that was a really big aha that we had. We found that particular thing, professional development, in all areas of their job except for administration. How interesting is that?
And we found them doing about 30% of their time on professional development, which is pretty sizable. Mm-hmm. Which actually, our session at NCSM, which is to some extent probably why we're doing this interview, is sort of connected to professional development because we're taking the idea of the flipped classroom model and turning that into flipped professional development, because specialists who we work with and others around the country, when they deliver quote unquote professional development, it's at crazy times. After school, before school, after school when everybody's like done mentally, before school when everybody's frankly more interested in getting the class ready for the kids and so forth. So how do you do this and what can you grab, and different versions of that. So the notions about different ways to engage professionals, not necessarily within the confines of the building, is the notion of the flip PD that we think is just makes sense.
Thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts, and it's been fantastic. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.